Welcome to the Spent the Rent podcast. I am your host, Patty Rose. My guest today is dear friend of the podcast, journalist for hire Daniel Miller. Daniel, welcome to the show.
Thank you so much for having me.
Yeah, this is really exciting. I've known you now for a couple years. You started coming into the barber shop because you worked as a bouncer a couple doors down at a bar on campus, and got into that with the backstory in fighting MMA. And so that's early on what we talked about a lot. And then you and I started getting into talking more about politics and global affairs. And I admire your positions and your viewpoints and your ability to try to reach across the aisle, so to speak, and try to persuade people with differing views to kind of hear challenging things and to learn, from somebody with a different perspective. So again, thanks for doing this. This is really exciting.
Yeah, I'm really excited to be here. It's my first podcast ever, and I'm a little nervous, but I think we'll get through it.
I think we'll be good. One of the things that I sought out when I started the podcast was to elevate voices of the underrepresented. So my podcast has been a lot of people's first podcast, because I want to bring people on that don't get a lot of exposure, maybe don't get a lot of interviews, because there's voices that just don't get heard very often. And we're going to touch on it in a little bit about your budding journalism career. And so you definitely are at the ground level of building a career. So this is something that's really exciting because I know that you have high aspirations where you're going to take that. So you grew up in Texas. Tell me a little bit about what, growing up in Texas and what brought you to Oregon.
Okay, so I was born and raised in Central Texas. I grew up in a small town called Goldthwaite. It has less than 2,000 people in the town and very conservative area. And after high school, I moved to a town called Stephenville. And a few years later, that's where I got into mixed martial arts. And so I got into that in 2009. And 2011, I turned pro and I moved up to Fort Worth to see where I could go with that career. And then during that time, I had shoulder surgery near the end in my career. And then that's when Donald Trump came onto the scene. And at that point in time, I was already interested in learning about religion and things like that and the different viewpoints. I was listening to debates and everything. And it started getting into politics too. And it just happened to be all at the same time when this is going on. And I started reading more. I started noticing more of news articles and kind of like just hyperbolic, claims coming across my Facebook news feed. And the more I started reading, the more I realized how much we were being lied to by a lot of people and how much we were being screwed over by our government. And I remember the thing that really that galvanized my interest in all of this. I clicked on an article I saw on Facebook, and it was from a right-wing source, and it said that Obama has done absolutely nothing for immigration. And I didn't know anything about that. And I was like, but just the way he said absolutely nothing. And I was like, that can't be. No, it turns out he was one of the harshest presidents ever. He deported more illegal immigrants in his first 5 years than Bush did in his entire 8.
Right. And the cages were put in place before Trump.
Yeah. And that's another thing is I started talking about Obama's immigration because people were all about Trump's immigration plan. And I was like, Obama's been pretty harsh too, because they were saying those same things. And it was met with just such vitriol and no investigation. I was just called a liberal and whatever else, whatever name, there's so many names that they call us.
Right. My favorite is libtard.
Then several years later, it surfaced that, Obama did play a major part in that. And the right wing was starting to run with that then. I was like, where were you guys 3 years ago?
Sure. Because it doesn't fit the narrative. So this was in Texas. This is your Facebook feed was primarily people in Texas and Oklahoma. And then what brought you to Oregon? You wanted to kind of see a different perspective?
I had heard that the Pacific Northwest was really beautiful, and it was an area that I've always wanted to go and explore. And University of Oregon had a really respectable journalism program, and Portland too. I moved to Portland for a few months. I just really wanted to experience something new in the area, and like you said, get different viewpoints and just get away. And I wasn't happy with the direction my life was going, and I felt that the best way for me to make a turnaround was to just get away from everything as much as possible and really work on myself.
And create
exactly what I did.
Like a completely new challenge, right?
Exactly. And I wanted to I had some things to prove to myself too. And I've always had the idea, like romantically, like the idea of starting somewhere new, just being in somewhere I didn't know anybody and seeing if I could make it. And
right.
It was really, really hard, but I did.
Yeah.
And I made connections and I made friends, and I really enjoyed my time up in Oregon, and I'd love to go back. I'm in Colorado right now, but I'd love to go back up there.
To Oregon?
Oh yeah, that's beautiful.
Yeah, Oregon is a vortex. I say this all the time. It's like if you get too far away, it will suck you back in. So we will definitely be glad to take you back. I'm an Oregon native, so I have that approval. I actually have some sway with the community.
I appreciate that.
So you attended University of Oregon, and you had kind of mentioned it that you studied journalism, and congratulations, you ended up getting your degree, class of 2020, the COVID class of 2020, where the pomp and circumstance was kind of swept out from underneath you. Unfortunately, there was no ceremony, only virtual, but your degree is the same. The education can't be taken from you.
Exactly what I went up there for. I was still ambivalent on whether or not I was going to participate in the ceremony. By the time
without COVID, right?
Yeah, I came up there to get an education. I didn't go up there to have pictures taken of me.
Sure. And one of the things that I know your time in Oregon that you've talked to me about, one of your roommates was an international student, and you made friends from all over the world. And not only did you get to meet some of the Oregon progressives, so to speak, but also on the University of Oregon campus, there's such an international presence and people from all over the country as well, that there's a real diversity on campus. And so,
yeah, I've met a lot of interesting people from all walks of life, all over the world. So I met a lot of people from China. I still keep in contact with several people from China. Some people from Africa too, some Europeans, but a lot from China and a good number from Africa, and then just all around the country too. A lot of people from East Coast and Midwest and stuff. And so yeah, I've gotten a lot of really good viewpoints. I had a lot of interesting conversations, a good many of them. And as you mentioned earlier, I worked at a bar. I did both, a bouncer and bartender. And I met a lot of interesting people there too, and a lot of libertarians I spoke with when I was bartending. Oh yeah, well when I was bartending, I got to have more one-on-one conversations with people like that, and especially during the day, and it's not near as hectic. And yeah, surprising number of libertarians around Eugene.
I think Eugene's funny. Eugene and Lane County in general has a lot more, we'll call them libertarians, but I think it has people that are kind of anti-government. I mean, I think it's funny that people think hippies are Democrats. That's not true to my experience. I mean, there's people that are hippie light that they agree on some things like it with hippies, but the hippies were anti-government, and so.
Well, the thing with the libertarians, we agree on so much. The things that we really have disagreements on are where to draw the government line.
Right.
And I haven't met a libertarian with the exact same viewpoint as the next libertarian, but most of them, from what I've gathered, is they want little to no government regulation with really anything. And that's where I draw the line, because you need certain government regulations to account for externalities, such as pollution that affects us all.
Right.
So that's just one place to start. And I'm in favor of as little government intervention as possible, especially in the personal life. But I think that government is necessary for regulating business, especially in this capitalist society that we live in. I mean, there has to be regulation, or else you get monopolies like Amazon.
Well, and then the humanitarian elements of it, and why I tend to be more progressive, is because if you have government completely just stays out of everything, then you've got just such a mismatch of opportunity for people,
Mm-hmm.
because you've got people that are, dealing with discrimination, that can't get housing, can't get jobs, can't get, what I mean? So there's all these different things. It's a difficult balance to find the proper amount of government needed. It's interesting because, we talk all the time about the government lying and the media lying to us, but then support progressive candidates that want more government. And this is an argument that you hear a lot from the right, but at the same time, it's like the right wants authoritarianism. I mean, we're seeing it more than ever right now. And so that they're okay with just law and order, which means business as usual. And it's a flawed system that's broken, that's not working for everybody. So there's no libertarian voters are really interesting, but there's really, with the two-party system, there's really not going to be libertarianism in this country. It's not an option, so.
Yeah, a lot of it's cloaked in conservatism too. I mean, you have Paul Ryan. I mean, he was a big libertarian. He loved Ayn Rand. Ron Paul. They love Ayn Rand. They're strict libertarians too.
Sometimes there's crossover where I agree with Rand Paul every once in a while, which is shocking. But then
what you said too with progressives wanting more government, I think that's kind of misleading. I would say pragmatic government. At least that's where I come from, and a lot of the progressive movement. That's what I've interpreted as well. We want a pragmatic government. So most progressive, like I said, we have that crossover with the libertarians to where we don't like the government involved in our personal lives. Libertarians, they're for drug legalization, just like progressives are. And
yeah.
I'll go so far and to say that I don't see the point in having government worried about who I marry. Like, why do they care about if you're married or not? Is it for tax breaks? Then you can just do common law. If you want to get married, then go to someone who will marry you. But I don't see why the government should really get involved in that either.
Right. And that's where there is some crossover. That's what I was kind of talking about with Rand Paul. There is some crossover where it's like the government just needs to stay out of our business. And I agree. As a progressive, I agree. Marriage equality is an issue that's one of my most important issues to me. Is I support, marriage equality. And to me, it's a freedom issue. To me, I can't understand how somebody that always uses freedom, it's my life, stay out of my life, then can talk about, oh no, marriage is only between a man and a woman. Because if you don't want to be married to someone of the same sex, don't marry them or don't do it. Yeah. That's all it is, So it's a freedom issue.
Yeah, it's marriage is between people who love each other.
Exactly. So anyway, so you study journalism at the University of Oregon. As of right now, you were working kind of freelance, and we're going to do a link in the show notes to your work. Daniel Miller for Hire is what your Facebook page is called.
Yeah, Daniel Miller, Journalist for Hire.
Journalist for Hire.
Yes.
And so I want to talk a little bit about your Facebook posts and the length of them and whatnot. A lot of people that are familiar with this podcast know that my goal has been to elevate voices of the people that I admire that are underrepresented. And a lot of times people ask me, how did you meet these people, or how did they become guests on your show? And a lot of times it's my Facebook feed coming to life. Now with you, you talked about it before, how you got off of Facebook and then you've been back on. So you've only been back on Facebook for a little bit now. So me and you met personally in the barbershop. But lately, your Facebook feed has been very enlightening and inspiring because you have been taking a lot of time writing very thorough articles with journalistic integrity, citing credible sources, focusing on historical evidence. Tell me a little bit about that, some of your recent posts and the things that you've been touching on.
Well, I'm glad to hear you say that it's been enlightening and inspiring, because that's what I shoot for. I try to base everything on what I think that people aren't being presented, like information wise. And, my Facebook feed is inundated with Black Lives Matter and then anti-protest. Everybody knows what's going on there. And I support, Black Lives Matter. I support that cause 100%. I condemn all rioting, looting. I feel like I have to add that caveat.
Yeah, we'll get to that in a little bit.
But, I like I said earlier, all the ways that the government has been screwing over the American people for generations, not just Trump administration. And I think that people need to know about that because it directly impacts their life.
Right.
So, that's why I talk a lot about the economy and, the sad state that it's in. And I know that the right-wing media, for years, they've talked about how good the economy is, but they've just been basing it on the stock market, which most Americans don't own stock. Matter of fact, I think that the top 10% own like 92% of the stocks. I believe that's the current number. That doesn't do anything. It's inflated because corporations, they bought their own stocks back.
Right.
Trump, his tax breaks, we call it corporate socialism, where 83% of the tax benefits go to the top 1% over the next 10 years. And if you're making less than $75,000, then your taxes will increase over that same time span. So this is something that I think a lot of people aren't aware of. And that tax law from 2017, I think a lot of people knew that it was a big giveaway to the rich, but I don't think they realized the ways that they were getting screwed over too.
Totally. And that's the big thing I think progressives try to point out constantly. You talk about pragmatic government, and it's like they actually want stuff that's going to work for more people, for not just the 1%. I read something recently on Facebook and it was an interesting thing. It said, what is something that is considered trashy if you're poor and considered classy if you're wealthy? And the comment, the one that got the most love, just said government subsidies. Because it's like when you're wealthy and you have a business that's getting constant government subsidies and basically taxpayers are paying. I mean, we could be here for days. So yeah. So with your journalism, you mentioned that you like to talk about economics and obviously political issues and historical relevance to political issues currently, like constitutional issues, because right now we're in a constitutional crisis with what's happening in the Northwest as far as the federal agents and the protesters. And we'll get to that in a little bit. But how do you decide on a topic, being that you're freelance and you already mentioned what kind of topics you like to cover, but how do you decide on a topic?
So I like to pick things that are relevant and or informative. So I check Twitter often and I see what's trending and what's going on, and I'll post accordingly. And if it's kind of a slow day, then I'll post maybe a history lesson that still is relevant to the current situation, or something about how to spot fake news, or how to disseminate propaganda, or different types of propaganda. It's little stuff like that. I really try and help people think about all the stuff that's going on, and
just from different perspectives. Yeah. And, challenging hypocrisy. One of the things that I see that you point out a lot is hypocrisy, and it's something that I do as well. And I mean, I have more of an angsty kind of reactionary approach to social media, and I'm the first to admit it. And so sometimes I end up blocking people because I'm butthurt. But you go at it with more integrity, with more patience, and I appreciate that, and I'm trying to learn from that. I'm not a journalist. I mean, you've gone through school to be a journalist, and even though I have a podcast, people are like, well, he didn't do that interview the right way. He talked about himself. I'm like, dude, this is not journalism. My goal is for people to do their own research on the topics that I cover. This is a form of entertainment for both me and for my audience. And it's also, a way, like I said, to elevate voices. Today, I'm elevating the voice of a journalist. So you're an actual journalist. I mean, what I'm doing is not journalism, So one of the things that's really big in the news right now, obviously, is what's happening in Portland in the Northwest. And I want to touch on this because we're going to be referencing it so much. Let's just get it out of the way. Okay. So one of the things you've been very vocal about is the constitutional crisis in Portland. Can you speak on that a little bit, and why what's happening is extremely unconstitutional with the federal agents?
And with what you broke up for a second.
Oh, with the federal agents. So why
Okay.
is what's happening in Portland and also Seattle, more Portland, the Seattle stuff is kind of starting. And I also want to touch on this first. This episode will be recorded 1 week before release. So some of the things that are being said a week's time in this whole situation could change a lot. So this was recorded the week before people are going to be watching it. But what can you tell us about what you've written about the constitutional crisis in Portland?
Well, I guess we can go back to the hypocrisy angle of it. I'm wondering where all of these staunch supporters of the 10th Amendment for states' rights are. Because this is a states' rights issue, and the states have made it explicit. They do not want the federal government there. Right. And that's been several state governments. I haven't looked into it in the past couple of days. But last I checked, it was unanimous. They didn't want the feds there. And they're there because of graffiti. They've had those photo ops. They've taken pictures in front of spray painted buildings. That's the extent that I've seen of it. There's no other real destruction. There are some businesses that are windows are busted out and things like that. But as for the federal building, like that's what they're there to protect. It's just spray painted. And the protesting and freedom of speech, that's constitutionally protected right. And freedom of speech and the ability to express yourself is the most important tool that we have as human beings, and that shall never be infringed upon. I'm a free speech absolutist. And once again, I do not condone rioting, looting, all of that.
Yeah, that's the difficult thing is how people decide when it becomes a riot. To me, the destruction of property, when you're breaking windows, and a lot of the graffiti in Eugene and in Portland happened early on, early in this, protests. And the difficult thing is that there's hundreds of people in Eugene, thousands of people in Portland that are protesting all day long, peacefully. There's grandmas, moms, dads with leaf blowers.
Oh yeah, there's a huge coalition of people now.
Right, and there's people that are standing up, against the feds being here. My thing is that now that the feds have made it a talking point for the left, and I'm going to get flack for this, but because they're like, okay, we don't want them here. What about before the feds got there? And I guess the issue of the feds being there is the escalation. The protests were starting to die down. Some of the conversations had been had about Black Lives Matter, about police brutality. People were talking. Everybody in the country was talking, especially here. I work in a barbershop, so I know full well that people were having conversations about police brutality, and that's the goal of these protests. Mm-hmm. Now, with it was starting to die down, because it wasn't getting as much traction. The feds come in and they blew it up. It's escalated to the point now where we are seeing violence, and we are seeing stuff towards the police that is really unacceptable. In Eugene last night, and again, this is a week behind when people are going to watch this, there was rocks being thrown at the police and fireworks and whatnot. Now, I haven't had enough time to digest exactly what happened, and I will by the time this is released. So I'm sure it's going to be much different. That's why it's difficult to do this, because I released the podcast a week later. But yeah, it's definitely a really challenging thing to even talk about. But do you believe that the question is, why is it that with social media that everybody's going all in? Do you believe that you can support the police and support Black Lives Matter?
Oh yeah, absolutely. I'm one of those people. So I don't know. It is hard to have a nuanced conversation around these things these days. This country has been so politically polarized, and we've just been conditioned to react. So if the opposition says something, then we have to think the opposite, and it's a divide and conquer strategy. And the left is historically bad at messaging,
framing.
Right, absolutely. It's historically very good at co-opting the message and hyperbolizing it and using it for their own purposes. So defund the police, for example. There's not an elected official who wants to completely defund the police. That doesn't mean abolish. Defund it means and not in elected politicians' eyes. I don't know of anyone who wants to abolish the police.
I think that, and even real quick, and I like where you're going with this, and I want you to continue. But when people say abolish the police, and this is where the framing is bad, this is proving your point. I think what they mean is abolish it and then start over with something that's going to be more, it's going to be more representative to the masses and not just certain people. It's not protecting property.
Some. There are some. I don't like to use that word radical, but there are some. I think it's a pretty radical position to completely do away with the police.
I do too.
And if that's what they mean is to abolish it and start over, well, that's what we all mean too, because we want to reallocate funds, and put in education and places that need it, but also reform. We need more extensive training, more than just a few months, and we need sweeping reforms.
Right.
Yes. We need the police, obviously, but I also think that we put a lot of pressure on them, and we expect too much out of them.
Right. Well, and they've cut so much funding. I mean, this is the problem is that there's so much funding been cut to mental health services that it's going to even happen more because that's usually done by the local government. That's done by cities, and like city council is working to find ways to help with like homelessness, for example. And then, the police are the ones that are actually on the beat. I mean, we're fortunate in Oregon that we have Cahoots. And Cahoots has gotten national coverage because they work with the police to decide what is not a situation that needs escalation. So Cahoots will go, and if there's a mental health crisis or situation, the police will work with them. And sometimes they show up together and the police will be like, okay, I think you got this. And I think that that's what people actually want.
That should have been done a long, long time ago. I mean, it's fantastic that's happening in Eugene. That should have been something that happened a long time ago.
Right.
And also with the cops, they're nervous. Of course they are, because anyone could have a gun.
Yeah. Too. Well, and we're seeing that a lot more from what I saw. Again, this is going to be a week behind, and so I'm not exactly sure what's going to have happened in that amount of time. I might be releasing this live so that I can touch on it. When I do release it, I'll do some follow-ups, but because you're going to be listening to this a week after this conversation. But go ahead.
Well, my biggest concern too is the disproportionate retaliation too with this. So graffiti does not equal federal troops coming in. That's the biggest issue I have, is that the responses to this aren't equal. This is a state government thing, and the state governments, whether or not someone feels that they're not handling the situation like they should, so they need federal troops, that's not up to them. This is a 10th Amendment states' rights issue, and if the states don't want the federal government involved, it shouldn't be there.
Right. I mean, I said it from the gate. It was probably 6 months ago. There was, and I've mentioned this on the podcast, there was a CNN on their 48-hour news cycle. It was probably over a weekend. I don't remember exactly. But they were talking about how Trump believes that he can win Oregon. So he's setting up a huge ground level base of campaigning in Oregon. And I told my girlfriend, I'm like, he does not think he can win Oregon. He is trying to get campaign ads where he's going to stoke the flames of Antifa because, they could show he's the law and order president, Well, that's not going to work. I'm sorry, but it's not going to. What we have right now is civil unrest, and civil unrest in not just in the Northwest. And, you see it across the country that there's massive protests that now people on both sides are coming armed. And so we're on the verge of something very dangerous. And the federal government is only escalating it because they don't know the people. The federal government doesn't, like you said, they're not in tune with the states. Unfortunately, you get the argument that people make about Oregon where they're like, well, the governor and the mayors need to do something. What do you tell those people?
Vote.
Yeah.
I mean, there's no, it's just an annoyance, it seems to everyone right now. There's no death or destruction. And when I say destruction, I mean like, buildings blown up, things like that. There's been relatively mild destruction. And it's been a shit show from the very beginning. Our federal government didn't handle the COVID crisis like it should have, and so it caused economic unrest. And also, back in April, I believe, when Dan Patrick goes on Tucker Carlson's show and encourages elderly people to get out there and, risk your life. Go ahead and die for the Dow, because we got to keep this economy going. And then you see it the next day or the day after, these right-wing protests. They're protesting a virus. They want to go back to work.
With ARs.
They stormed in Minnesota. Armed protesters were inside the Capitol building at the base of the stairs
with weapons,
angry at the government. And nobody was arrested. No federal troops were called in there. Nothing. And a guy from the Trump administration, I don't remember his name or position now, but he went on a right-wing radio show, just like this video and everything. And he said that the riots in Michigan, there was at least one donor who said that he would pay for the legal bills of anybody who was arrested for that protest. They're out there trying to get people to go back and die for the Dow, and it was just downhill ever since. And there wasn't an adequate response from the federal government about COVID. And like I said, it created economic unrest and uncertainty to where it kind of made people feel like they had to get back to work. They had no other choice.
Die for the Dow. I like that. That's an interesting way to put it.
I call them neo-communists.
Yeah.
It's same thing as Mao, Pol Pot, Stalin. I mean, they had people they worked themselves to death for the economy to save the economy.
Right. And that's
a very simplified version.
Sure. And, that's for Trump. I mean, the economy was his talking point. And so there's this whole belief from people that are small-minded that they're like, oh, this whole thing is orchestrated just to make him look bad. And it's just insanity. It's just insanity, and they talk about, there's so much projection. People talk about all the protesters. They're like, oh, that's being paid for by George Soros, and I'm just like, dude, there's literally evidence of Trump rallies where they're paying people to go. There's Craigslist ads that are literally like, I don't know.
Yeah. Oh yeah. I remember hearing about those too. I forgot there was something else I was going to.
So I wanted to touch on, we talked a little bit about some of the journalistic work that you've done freelance and some of the posts on Facebook that you've been putting out. One of the things that you talk a lot about is foreign relations. And I know that this is something that you're very passionate about and something that people just don't have a big understanding of. So Yemen is a place that is a situation that people have no idea what's going on. And you've talked to me about it, and I know very little. So tell me about the genocide that's happening in Yemen.
So this happened, the Yemeni civil war began in 2015 with the overthrow of Hadi. I forget his full name, but I think he was Sunni Muslim and friendly to Saudi Arabia. And the Houthi government, the Shia Houthi government, or rebels, overthrew Hadi and replaced their guy named Saleh, Salah, S-A-L-A-H, I believe. So there's been infighting ever since. And the Houthi rebels are backed by Iran, and Iran is, they're enemies with Saudi Arabia. So this is a proxy war going on. And our involvement, we have been, we've been giving them bombs, and we've been fueling their aircrafts.
The Saudis.
Saudi Arabia is indiscriminately bombing Yemen civilians, open air markets, schools, hospitals. People are dying from starvation. It's a humanitarian crisis there. People are dying from cholera outbreaks, and it's one of the poorest countries in the world. And most of the disputes are territory in the southwestern peninsula, because there's that port into the Red Sea.
Now, you've talked about this quite a bit on your Facebook feed. I've talked to you more off air, but you've done coverage of this on social media. What kind of response does that get? Are people interested in foreign relations? Are they right now? We're so focused on what's going on with COVID and domestic stuff. Does it fall on deaf ears when you talk about, global stuff?
Yeah, so I've touched on American imperialism a little bit. I just don't think people realize like the severity of it and how much damage that this country is responsible for over generations.
Right.
We've overthrown. I don't know how many governments we've overthrown or have attempted to overthrow since the CIA came about in 1953. I think it was. No, right. 52. Anyway, but one of the first ones that we did was we overthrew the Iranian government in 1953. Their democratically elected leader, Mohammad Mossadegh, he decided that he wanted to nationalize oil and give profits back to the Iranian people, which in turn that would have taken profits away from Britain and some from us. But Britain got us to intervene, and we overthrew their leader and replaced him with Reza Shah. And so the Shah was in power until 1979. He was very friendly to the U.S. and our economic interest. And then he was overthrown by an even more radical right-wing government that instilled the monarchy again, named Ayatollah Khomeini. And ever since then, we've had sour relations with Iran, and the hostage situation over in Lebanon with Carter and all that, and then the way Reagan handled that situation with the Iran-Contra affair, and he was illegally selling arms. Well, his involvement isn't, proven, but it was speculated that he knew about selling arms to Iran, and that money that we got from them, we were funneling to rebel groups in Nicaragua to overthrow their government. And there's been a lot in between there too. And we've done a lot of damage in Southeast Asia and Central America. And here recently, actually, we in November or late October 2019, we helped overthrow the government of Bolivia. Evo Morales, he was president since 2006, and his term limit, he couldn't run for president again. So he put forth a referendum to abolish term limits, and that was voted down. But the Supreme Court ruled that term limits were unconstitutional. So whatever your stance is on that, I personally feel like there needs to be term limits. But also here, if this were to happen in the United States, they abolished term limits and then someone won a third term, there's nothing we can do about it. We'll say, well, that's what the Supreme Court ruled. That's exactly what happened here. And the election, so the way they do it, they get votes for so the reporters can report on it, and then they get later votes like from the villages and the jungles and everything. And so Morales was up by 7 points, and the opposition was already claiming that it was starting to look fraudulent. And there's still a lot of votes from the villages have yet to be counted. When they did come in, then it put Morales up by over 10 points. And the way that their system works is that if there's more of a 10-point margin, then that person's declared the winner. They don't have a second election or anything like that, because they're going to have like a runoff. And it was completely consistent because Morales had a lot more support in the rural areas. And so when the results came in, then it was completely consistent with all the polling and everything. Even Morales said, hey, if you think there's voter fraud, fine, we'll have another election. Let's do it. And so we, I forget the initials now, but there's a committee in Central America to oversee elections, and we fund 60% of that committee. And there's been pressure from Marco Rubio and the Trump administration to oust Morales. And so what happened there was they started disputing the claims of the election, and the military forced Morales to step down. That's what you would call a coup. He feared for his safety. I actually saw a video of this. His house was ransacked.
Wow.
And torn to pieces. And he fled to Mexico. Mexico offered him asylum.
Safe haven, yeah, asylum.
Safe haven. And so he took that, and like I said, the military forced him to step down. This came after he was like, yeah, let's have another election. Let's do it. Right. And as of still today, this month, they had an investigation that ended several months ago. I couldn't find any reports that said that the election was fraudulent. Every report that I found said there's no indication that any funding business ever occurred with that. Right. Now, who leads the country? It's I can't remember her name now, but she was like a vice president in the Senate or something like that. And our government's different than ours a little bit. She's a theocrat. She held up the Bible and said that, biblical rule is now back in Bolivia. And last I heard, she was forcing all the indigenous people out of the city and into the country.
Wow.
And she's a racist too. I mean, she doesn't think they have any business. Indigenous people have no business being in the cities.
Right. And so the reason for covering these stories is because you're like, we cannot let this happen there at all. But we also are seeing some of these parallels to what's coming here, and where do you get a lot of your sources? I mean, when it comes to foreign relations, what is a source that you like to turn to?
Multiple sources.
Absolutely.
I don't have a single source. So Twitter, I've come across a lot of great journalists on Twitter, and so I just compare their reporting to other reports and historical context too. I've really tried to go back and study the history of American foreign policy and how we got to the situation to begin with, and it all just kind of comes together and makes sense. And even some of the reports where you're not sure, do they sound plausible? Well, yeah, based on everything that I know so far, stuff like that sounds plausible. With this story, it's pretty well documented by now. There's a Twitter thread. I forgot what his name now is, from a journalist. He went into great detail on the Bolivian coup, and so I think that's a new type of news information that I think is very underutilized. I've talked to so many people.
And you're referring to social media?
Well, Twitter.
Yeah.
Using Twitter as a source. The trending topics are great, and reading the comments, things that journalists post, things that historians post.
So to see if there's consistency. I mean, when you say using Twitter as a source, I don't think what you mean is that like Twitter is the news outlet. It's that there's so much of more of an independent. It's like independent journalists that are there. There's consistency that you start to see. You start to see trends,
Yeah, and like I said, when you read comments on articles and stuff, you'll learn some little tidbits that you never would have known before.
Right.
So you have to read a lot, and so with Twitter, you get a lot of their anecdotes, a lot of them, and
because it's so short.
Historians or amateur historians, people that do the research but just don't have much of a platform, do it for fun, and they'll share their information too, and a lot of interesting stuff from there.
I just worry about misinformation with just all journalism, but with social media, that there's a lot of misinformation as well. And unfortunately, it's like, just because we see things that are happening consistently on social media, you see like a lot of the same kind of threads. That doesn't necessarily mean that there's evidence to support it. I'm not challenging what you're talking about, especially with international stuff, because the coverage for foreign affairs in America is garbage when it comes to like the mainstream media. I mean, it's absolute garbage. They never tell the full story. My favorite
they perpetuate the status quo.
Oh yeah, my favorite source, or for like American journalism, I love the show Frontline. And Frontline does, a lot of times they have freelance journalists that do these different spotlights and whatnot. It's on every Tuesday on PBS or OPB. But Frontline does a really good job, showing really good journalism where they show multiple sides. We had talked about Portland and the constitutional crisis, and Oregon is no stranger to this, because we saw a constitutional crisis with what happened with the federal building being taken over by the ranchers, by the Bundys. You remember that whole situation?
Yeah, a few years ago.
And that was where the right wing was definitely in support of it. And so, and I tried to stay out of that one because I waited for a long time to really form too strong of an opinion, because I think that they had some valid arguments. I think some of the ways that they went about it were wrong. Then I think that when the local people, if anybody's unfamiliar with this, I'm going to plug something they can check out. But the people in the community were like, we don't want these people here anymore. They're not even from here, and they're coming here to make a statement. And so at that point, I think people need to be listening to the people. And it's kind of like what we're seeing right now in Portland, where people have basically gone all in. If they support the protesters, they're like, okay, no amount of destruction is gonna make me think what they're doing is wrong, which is difficult. There's so much more nuance to it. So the movie, real quick, that I want to say, and that's the argument that's being had. I'm not saying that's.
I'm glad you brought that up. By the way,
hold on a sec. You can find it on Netflix. It's called American Patriot, and it's the story about the Bundy ranchers that was actually put on Frontline. American Patriot, and it's great. And they do show multiple sides of it. And so I think that there's great journalism that you can find in the States, but they definitely, it's pretty hard to find. And I love Frontline. I watched a really good one about Saudi Arabia, about the Crown Prince, and I feel like Frontline does a really good job on Frontline.
But, no, Frontline, how do I watch Frontline?
Frontline's on OPB. So you can actually go to their website and PBS or OPB and just you can stream it for free after the fact. Now, what did you want to touch on that I had brought up?
Oh, well, so the Bundys, they took over a federal building.
Yeah. And then we're able to get care. Yeah, and we're able to get care packages.
Yeah, and I remember a lot of people sending dildos though too.
Yeah.
To them. I remember reading about that story. I don't know, about 6-7 months ago. A reporter, David Newert.
If anybody's unfamiliar, so what happened with the Bundys, and this is my basic understanding, you got to do your own research on this one, but basically there was ranchers that were used to having their cows graze on BLM land. Ironically, it's business and land, or what is it? What is BLM?
Yeah, business and land management, I believe. It's here in Colorado too. Yeah.
Right. And so they were used to grazing for free on quote unquote federal land, right? And so the government basically said, you can't do this anymore. So I think they were going to be taxed or something, like, now if you want to have them graze here, you have to pay and whatnot. And so they tried to make the argument that they're like, well, it's our land. It's America. There's no such thing as federal land. It belongs to the people, which we can have that argument, because I actually kind of agree with that. Do you know what I'm saying? To an extent, it's like, what the hell? Why is this precedent being set? Anyway, so in order to protest that, they basically said, like, we're going to prove that we own everything. Am I saying this right? I mean, this is what it sounds like.
Pretty much. That's what I'm remembering. Yeah, you recently watched something on it. It's been
it's been a couple years actually that I've watched that. Okay. I waited to watch it because Frontline a lot of times does coverage after the fact really well. Like they just released something about Iraq that was exceptional. That was like a couple weeks ago, their episode, and it was about live. It was individual stories about Iraq before, during, and after the war. And it was really, really cutting edge and just really awesome, because it showed perspectives like these people that were like, oh, we loved it when the Americans liberated Iraq, but then they kind of left us in the dark and left us in the dust. And it was like, maybe it's a little bit worse. I just like things that are unapologetic about, if it's critical of America, it can show that this is the thing. It's like, American exceptionalism is dangerous, because we as a country, I love this country so much, and I know you do as well. Criticizing it is because we are evolving, we are growing, and we can learn from our mistakes. It's totally okay with me if a politician makes a massive, not massive mistake, but if they make mistakes and they learn from it, but you would hope that they would do their research beforehand so that they wouldn't make blunders. You never know what's going to happen, cause and effect, when it comes to especially foreign relations.
No kidding. And real quick, how would it look if one of the protesters or several of the protesters took over the federal courthouse in Portland? What do you think right-wing media would do? They would be calling for the truth. They would say that Antifa are out of control and that the federal government needs to do something. But when the Bundys take over a federal building, then nobody really cares.
They're patriots. They're called patriots. And this is
the thing with the land. It's funny that they said that too, because conservatives are staunchly in favor of land ownership, and where the federal government, they don't want the government to have any land. They want it all privatized, like the extreme conservatives do. So that's funny, that dichotomy there.
Oh yeah, there's so much.
Bundy's like it's all the people's land. Oh yeah, we could be in agreement with that too.
Right. And unfortunately, the hypocrisy, pointing it out, has lost any effect because the extremes don't care. People are in their corners and they're like, whatever, if we do it, it doesn't matter if we do it. I was watching MSNBC the other night and they were talking about the protests in Portland, and they said, this is a constitutional crisis and Donald Trump is only doing this to escalate. And they're telling a lot of things that I actually agree with, but at the same time, I felt like they were leaving out some key important parts to it. But then this is where it's not even. Like, there is the coverage, there's omission is one of the biggest issues in American media.
Lying by omission.
Yeah, lying by omission. And that's what I feel like NBC was doing. But then you turn it to Fox. And Fox, there's this woman that is half robot that basically says, like, and I don't even know if she has these views or if it's just a paycheck, and she says, oh, these Antifa, I think that they're just protesting because they haven't accepted the results of the 2016 election, which is a president who was duly elected, which is a bold-faced lie because he lost the popular vote. And then they're literally just talking points, calling them these America-hating terrorists. That's what they said about Antifa.
All the buzzwords.
And they're only they say Antifa, but then they start to say about all of the protesters that it's just a violent scene. They neglect to tell you, here's the omission, where it's 4 city blocks. And then at night, there is destruction of property and there has been some acts of violence towards police. But during the day, it is the masses of it. There's so many people that are involved, that are standing up, and it's a peaceful protest. I encourage anybody, you have to watch the live feeds. You have to see that the situations escalate when the federal troops come in, and before the federal troops were there, when the police come in and try to escalate and show a show of force. It's just a crazy situation. And unfortunately, people that are busy, which is fine, when they only want to see one side of it, you can get that confirmation bias. It's definitely there for you, and you've been arguing with a lot of your friends from Texas and Oklahoma on Facebook. What are you seeing? Like, what is the one thing that you deal with the most when it comes to arguing with facts? Like, with people will not look at facts.
I deal with hypocrisy a lot. And that's, again, like, where are the states' rights people for all of this? And now you have the Fox News saying that people hate America. They've said that about anybody who's not conservative. Well, look, nobody who's politically active in America hates America. We just have our own version of how we can make it ideal. Thomas Jefferson said that dissent is the highest form of patriotism.
Sure.
So I just got to ask those people, is he wrong? I don't think he is.
Martin Luther King said that rioting is the voice of the unheard.
Mm-hmm.
I missaid that last week. I said protest. It's actually rioting. That's the quote. There's also a quote that I love, not to cut you off, but Propagandhi, they're a Canadian punk band, but Propagandhi, and I think I've mentioned this on the podcast before, they have a line that it's my favorite line in any song ever. And it says, The system I oppose affords me the luxury of biting the hand that feeds. And that's exactly why privileged fucks like me should whine and kick and scream till everyone has everything they need. And so to me, it's like, because it's like we will continue to fight until we see equity and equality. And it's never going to change. And so this is the thing that people are like, I wish that things could just go back to normal, like what's happening in Eugene and Portland and Seattle and really across the country with the protests, turned riots at night, whatever you want to call it. There is a point where it needs to be policed, where it needs to be stopped, because we will not accept violence. But that being said, the federal intervention is dangerous, and it has caused an escalation and will continue to. And it's literally for campaign ads for Trump. And I've been saying it from the gate. I've been saying it since before it started. I'm coming up on my 100th episode, and I'm planning on doing where I touch back on some of my predictions. And it's going to be funny because a lot of them were wrong. I thought Elizabeth Warren would do good, just different things.
You can't, well, it's hard to predict anything as it is, but man, especially in the political atmosphere in America the past few years, you can't predict a damn thing.
Well, COVID, I mean, honestly,
we have such a capricious president. You never know what he's going to say. No. I wake up in the morning, just hope that I don't get any, terrible news.
Right.
It's something that our president could have said or done. I mean, he almost started World War III at the beginning of the year when he bombed, when he killed Soleimani, the Iranian general.
Right.
You know what? He was coming back on a peace mission from Saudi Arabia.
Sure.
He was coming back from a peace deal.
We haven't heard the end of that one. And I think, my goal with doing these podcasts and bringing people on is to introduce the individual, you in this case, to my audience. And then in the future, I can have you back on and we can hone it in, focusing on one specific issue. I know foreign relations is something that you're very passionate about. So maybe down the road, we can do an episode about Iran, because there's a lot of stuff about it. So Daniel Miller, I really appreciate you. It's cool to call you a friend. We've tried to do this interview multiple times and had different issues that it's pretty funny behind the scenes. So I think we finally have done it. It's pretty cool. And this is a friendship that I want to continue to grow. One thing I want to talk about is I want to mention, I'm going to be rolling out something new on my website where I have guest viewpoints from journalists, from opinion pieces. I want to spotlight some of your work on my website. So for anybody listening to this, stay tuned, because my website, which is STRPOD.com, is going to be rolling out a blog section with guest viewpoints, editorials, really cool stuff. So we're going to actually get into a realm of a little bit more journalism. It's all independent. If anybody'd like to support the podcast, they can go to strpod.com/sponsors and make a one-time or monthly donation. I'd like to give a shout out to my title sponsor, Oregon Cashflow Pro. Oregon Cashflow Pro is on YouTube, and anybody listening to this, I need you to do me a huge favor. Go to Oregon Cashflow Pro's YouTube channel. So go to YouTube and search for Oregon Cashflow Pro and subscribe. He's getting so close to hitting that 1,000 subscriber mark where then it can monetize. He's been working really hard, and he does everything for free. There's free money management videos that you can watch, and it's really cool. So if you're a fan of this podcast, I need you to do that for me. Go follow Oregon Cashflow Pro on YouTube. Daniel Miller, this is really cool to talk to you and get to pick your brain.
Yeah, it's a fun experience.
Yeah, it's cool, and I'm really inspired by your work. And I'm going to mention it again in the show notes of this episode. I'm going to put a link to your Facebook page for your journalistic work. And, I encourage anybody listening to follow that. They can engage with you, which is really cool about social media, is that you're accessible. And if people want to challenge your ideas, you welcome it, which is something that I admire. I like reading the comment board because it is a different perspective, because you get a lot of people from, Texas and Oklahoma that are arguing with you on different things. And it's interesting. And you've got a no quit attitude, and you also don't block people. You get blocked yourself, but you're not somebody that, unless they're being annoying, you said.
Yeah. And I don't resort to personal insults. I really try and stick with the topic as much as possible. And if I can tell someone's not wanting to have a good faith discussion, then I just don't have time for them.
Sure. I block people.
I'm willing to engage with people who really want to talk about the issues.
Right. I block people all the time. And usually it is because of just that. It is because they've taken it to personal insults. You know, I had someone recently that I'm not going to say the name, but he been friends with him on social media for a long time, and then outside of it as well. But he was calling people effing idiots and just unwilling to. It just gets to a point where I'm like, you know what? One of the things that I use my personal Facebook feed for my entertainment. So I don't know. I mean, yes, it's important to hear other people's perspectives, but if you use the word libtard, I've already made this decision. If someone says libtard, they get blocked. And I've blocked.
They don't really know what they're talking about anyway.
We're done. Like that's a game changer. I mean, it's like if I saw someone use the N-word, they'd be gone too. You know what I'm saying? Like there's no hesitation. So what's funny is that I went through KVAL comment section and KEZI, like local news in Eugene, and anybody that said libtard, I blocked them. And I did that for a couple weeks. So now that things have gotten so crazy, what I've been seeing is that there's a lot of holes in my Facebook feed, people arguing with themselves because they're arguing with someone that said libtard. And so my block list is like bigger than any protest. That's the irony of it. So yeah, I don't give a shit about it. I will block you if I feel like it. People can say what they want.
Sometimes you got to weed out the riffraff and just if people won't stop, then you got to stop it.
They just don't bring
anybody's free speech. It's your own private. You're good.
That's the biggest thing that cracks me up is that people say, "Oh, this is a violation of my First Amendment rights." Facebook and
the government
have nothing to do with it. Now, that being said, unfortunately, I am an elected official now, sort of, as a committee person. So I wonder if there is a constitution. There's a constitutional thing because, not for I'm such a small level of elected office, but I think you're not supposed to block people because they can see your.
Actually, you do need to look into that because that was the federal level for sure. Like Trump
on Twitter,
it was ruled that it was unconstitutional for him to block people. So I think he had to unblock people.
I know, it's disgusting.
It makes sense.
I'm not going to play by the rules until the Supreme Court tells me to change it. No. So Daniel Miller, thank you very much for doing this. I picked a song a little different than normal. I play a lot of hip hop on this show. I picked a song by a punk band from Eugene. And it's called Bilateral, which I thought was kind of fitting because it's about the duality of everything and how there's. So this is the song I'm going to end with by Not a Part of It. Jason Burton's a good friend of mine. Shout out to Jason Burton and his band Not a Part of It. So this is Not a Part of It, Not a Part of It with the song Bilateral. Daniel Miller, thanks a lot.
Thank you so much for having me. I really enjoy being on.
You're welcome.
Surely that's a little bit. Stop children and amputees. Trying to live too hungry beats. Run as it disappear. Cost the balls and flip the fear. Can we see through other eyes? Can we find a pulse? No. Many cops and many crooks. Robbers, yours, storybooks. Cheaters in hip cafes, flames that cut us north and way. Force me and force him, we are all in the rain. Let's take the time to learn about what's going inside America. Yeah!